Psychoanalysis, the other, the deeper processes. Namaste. I and the other are at the root of a range of psychic processes. Some of these processes are known and some are deep and esoteric. Our exploration today is of the deep and esoteric processes related to the other. Conversation involves as guide psychoanalysis consultant, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So how do we roll out background for the concept of the other?
The concept of the other is central to many areas of discussion, some in psychoanalysis, some in philosophy, some in sociology. In psychoanalysis, we can start with the other. As we roll out the canvas of the other, we can start with the other used in a more philosophical way. Sartre used the concept of the other, and what we will do is we will start with the most healthy, the adult, and slowly go to the infant, to the earliest phases and the most psychologically difficult and sick phases of the human mind. So we start with the first element in the canvas of the other, the element as Sartre used it. Sartre used it for the adult man, for a very healthy man. And he used it to say, he used to use a phrase, very popular, the other is the hell. Meaning the other does not do as I want him to do. The other does not allow me to live as I want to live. And therefore, the other comes between me and the satisfaction of my desire. And he is the one who creates hell out of my life. And therefore, the other is the hell. And then he expands the concept of the other to mean not only individuals, but say laws of nature. The laws of nature come between me and my final satisfaction, my complete satisfaction. The other is destiny. The other is the heritage, the traditions, everything that constrains me. It's almost as though, to use a Lacanian phrase, the other is almost like the symbolic order or the name of the Father. That which stops the endless satisfaction of my eros. And therefore, Sartre used the concept, the other is the hell, in a philosophical sense. But his idea...
when we say philosophical sense, when we say this philosophical sense, is it only the outwardly things, or is he also talking about something from the inner world also, the other, like superego or ego?
Yeah, so at least the body is included in the other. Because he is not a psychologist, so does not go into the components of the personality per se, but the body is included. But if you take the spirit of what he says, not the letter, what he says is stretched to me that everything except my desire is the other. And because this other does not yield in a way so as to satisfy my desire, it creates a hell. So that would include not only the body, but also our superego. And by stretch, it would also include the ego. So Sartre started using this in a philosophical sense, where the other was the hell. And then in psychoanalysis, we have Kohut, who talks about the other in a slightly different way. Kohut talks about the other in two ways. One, positively, when he says the other is the sunshine.
Okay.
So the other, the presence of the other provides me with positivity, energy, coherence, happiness, enthusiasm. And if I am lonely and there is no other, the loneliness leads me to anxiety, to loneliness, to depression, to lack of motivation, to pessimism, to disintegration, to chaos. Whereas the other, the presence of the other automatically brings about coherence, coordination, positivity, energy, goal. So he talks first about the positive aspect of the other. He talks about the difficult other, where he says, early life, if you don't have good enough others who don't do certain things which are required to be done in early childhood, it creates an unhealthy self. And the unhealthy self is a fragile self. It is a fearful self. It is a demotivated self. It is an anxious self. It's a disintegrating self. It is not an enterprising self. It's a withdrawing self. It is not a stable self. It's a very unstable, labile self. It's a pessimistic self, not an optimistic self. So he then talks about the difficult parts of the other. If the other is not good enough in early childhood, it can leave very difficult things for a long time or maybe lifelong for the person. So Kohut brings in the concept of the other in this sense. Winnicott brings in the concept of the other by the term of the good enough mother. That it's very necessary to have good enough mother. And in Klein, we see this in the form of good, reliable, stable object. That there is criticality of a good other, a good, reliable, stable object for internalization of a good, reliable, stable object is at the core of the healthy personality. Going further deep, we get into the concept of the other in Margaret Mahler, in the idea of I and not I. Very early in life, when the concept of the I and not I is not yet clear, at that point, there are, and by nature, automatically we start developing the sense of I and not I. It's inbuilt, it's hardwired into us. It's a hardwired part of the developmental process. So when that happens, there are two forces which are opposing to each other. A force to fuse back and remain in the oceanic state, and of which is the force of fusion. And there is a force of individuation trying to separate. And these two forces are at loggerheads. The force of fusion, which does not want us to go into the next stage of I and not I. It wants to remain in that oceanic state. And there is a force of individuation, which wants us to get into that state of I and not I. And these two forces, and obviously in all healthy people, the force of individuation has to win for us to develop the sense of I and not I. And in almost all individuals, except the rarest of the rare, this happens. So the force of individuation wins, and therefore the other gets created. If we remain fused, there is no the other. It's only one oceanic state. Also, it depends upon to whom we fuse with. If we fuse with a person, then there is a kind of a micro oceanic state of a dyad, which is what we see in a narcissistic dependent relationship.
Right.
There's an attempt to create a micro dyad again, a micro oceanic state again. And this, once the forces of individuation win and the other comes into picture, then the other gets differentiated further into what Lacan would call the small other and the big other, and everything in between. So the other gets differentiated into first I and the mother. The mother is the first other, and then the father, the second other, and then the society, the third other, and then the history and the culture, the law and the political state, the fourth other, and then the past, the history, the culture, the fifth other. And then events happening in the world, the sixth other, which are outside of our control, and then God or the seventh other. So the other, what is not us, gets divided into so many things. So the other is then divided into so many things. And this basket of the other obviously has all the good, bad, and the ugly. From God to devil, everything is in this basket of the other. So there is a range of psychic phenomena then which happens with each of these others. Obviously, in psychoanalytic language, we call it object relations in the Kleinian terms. But with each element of this other, relationships happen, good, bad, and ugly, everything put together. And they in turn create very early life patterns and schemas, which later on become the automatic unconscious basis of operation of the psyche. So this is how we can start with the laying out, rolling out the canvas of the other, where the first is the other as it starts. So you have the oceanic state and the tendency to remain there, and then the tendency to individuate, resulting in the creation of the other. And then the bifurcation, not bifurcation, but the differentiation of the other into many different types of the other, and then the object relations with each of these others. That creates this whole early life drama of the psyche, which is so central to lifelong psychological health.
So when we refer to this concept of I and not I, what phenomena of early life around the other are important from standpoint of the pathology?
If we converge on the element of pathology, we don't have to go into all the phenomena of the other, but we can focus only on a few which are relevant from a psychopathology standpoint. Early life, Freud talked about the state of no other, which was the state of the oceanic state. Now, what Freud talked about was the oceanic state so as to mean that it is always a blissful state, an ecstatic state. And this is a state to which one always yearns to go back to. And you cannot, because the object relations, the other, once it has stabilized in the mind, there is no returning back. There is no turning back of the clock. You can never be in a state of not the other, unless you go into the spiritual state, which we'll touch upon a few minutes later. But in the realm of Western psychotherapy, once the other is established, there is no going back. And with that, the intensity and the ecstasy and the bliss that you felt in the state without the other, that can never be felt. And there's always a lifelong learning in Freud's view of trying to go back there. And we try very hard, most conspicuously in areas where we can, for some moment, to some extent, we can lose ourselves. We can lose our distinct sense of self, which can happen in sexual act, which can happen in act of consumption of drugs and alcohol. It can happen in exhilaration. Sorry, you said something?
I thought probably meditation.
Yeah, in meditation also. Of course, that was not in Freud's radar. His radar would not catch those flying saucers there. But so these are the states where, to some extent, for some time, we lose a sense of a distinct self, partially or completely. And therefore, we try our best to get back to that oceanic state without the other, but usually we cannot. So Freud had that thing in his mind, but there is a correction here. The correction being, the early life state without the other is not necessarily only a blissful ecstatic state. The oceanic state should not be confused with being only a blissful ecstatic state. It's also a terrifying, terrorsome state. It's also a suffocating state. It's also a chaotic state. So you
How?
pass through a range of experiences, even in that oceanic. The oceanic state is not of one color, it's a multicolored experience. It is not as though if the oceanic state continues for, let us say, the first 5 days of your life, it is not that you are going to be in ecstasy and bliss for the 5 days. A few hours you will be in ecstasy and bliss. A few hours you will feel the suffocation. A few hours you
Right.
will feel the hunger and the helplessness and the desperation. And a few hours, if the death instinct and the imagination has started, you may feel terrifying, terrorsome experiences, even in that oceanic state with nowhere to go.
Right.
So the oceanic state itself is a multicolored state. So you can divide it into two: the blissful, ecstatic oceanic state and the terrifying oceanic state. And the third, the chaotic or the suffocating oceanic state. We divide actually into 4 or 5 different types of oceanic states. So this is the first stand where the other, when it is not there, what difficulties can pathologically arise, we get a taste of it. And often you can have regression to these states or experiences nearing this state in pathological states. So this is one part. The second part relates to going back to the pleasant oceanic state. The pleasant oceanic state, if you regress back to, and this we see in what I call the happy psychosis, where somebody is diagnosed of schizophrenia, he has psychotic features, but on the whole, he looks very happy, and there is a kind of an orgasmic shine on his face. And he seems to be experiencing part bliss, part ecstasy. And that is where a part of the regression is back to the good part, the ecstatic, blissful part of the oceanic state. And therefore, the abdication of the other, the closing on the other and being only oneself in that oceanic state, that is the first point that we see where having the other and not having the other, they come together. Where partly the man is terrified of the persecuting other, and partly he goes into a state of no other. So he complains of persecution, delusion of persecution. At the same time, he looks very happy. So there is a part regression to the state of no other and the good part of the state of no other. Occasionally, there is a terrifying experience of the state of no other. And then there is experience of the persecuting other. All together in that schizophrenic presentation.
When you talk about absence of that no other, is it to do with the stability part as well? That there is some other, but the psyche has not identified with the stability of the presence.
Yeah, obviously, if the man is of 35 or 30 years of age, the other has been established, and there are many the others in the mind of the person. But
no, for example, I was thinking that is in case of a regular environmental developmental stages. Suppose somebody is an orphan, right, and was abandoned right in the childhood after 5 days, 10 days, or maybe immediately after birth. And now that person is experiencing on the loss of some near and dear one. That person experienced this weird kind of negative oceanic fusion.
correct.
And so now there is this total absence. But वहाँ पे कोई ना कोई caretaker रहा होगा who would be providing some kind of attendance to the child, but that is not stable and one significant other.
Correct. So that brings in a very important element of the quality of the other, especially the quality of the first other. The second other can be the paternal other. which may have more to do with superego formation. But the first is very important in the case of development of self and the development of trust in the world.
Right.
The
Right.
development of catastrophic thinking. The first other is very now that is where the quality of the first other, which usually is the mother or the caregiver, that comes in. This brings us to the phenomena of the lost other.
Right.
The lost other, and I'm referring more specifically to the lost first other. The mother or the primary caregiver, the first other. So the loss of the first other. Now there are two kinds of these losses, which I was going to refer a few minutes from now, but since subject has come up, you can think of the lost other in two ways, especially in the context that you have raised. The context of abandonment by the real parents and the child going to the orphanage. One of the most tragic things to happen. And this is this, that the lost other may have been lost when the child was capable enough of understanding and recognizing. Let us say the abandonment by the parents happens at 4 or 5 years of age. So the lost other is remembered by the child. Or let us say somebody abandons the child at 4 months of age, in which case the lost other also is lost. So I call that the lost other. The child cannot remember the lost other.
So but the memory of lost is also lost. Yeah, the specifics of that are lost, but the effects remain. Effective. The color and form of that object is lost, but the loss of the object remains. And this is where what Bjorn calls the nameless dread, similarly a nameless loss happens. And it's very difficult to link up a name with that nameless loss. It's very difficult to bring it into the discourse of the conscious mind. Because there's a strange kind of refractiveness to such losses, that the affective shield which protects it, it has a very refractive nature. It does not allow access to that memory or discussion of that memory into the conscious mind. It's like once we had a discussion, the title was "Some Stories Can Never Be Told." This is one of those situations where the story can never be told. Somewhere, I remember one of the cases I was seeing, while you're explaining this part, I am getting in touch with it, that sometimes a negative depression, negative schizophrenia, negative psychosis, where even the symptoms are on mute mode, takes us to that stage where the loss object, what you're referring to. I'm getting in touch with that. I'm not able to articulate it fully, but somewhere. Some situations you will have of that type. Some situations you will have of such bottled up anger that the only refuge is to go back to primary states of oceanic states. Or at least, if not the oceanic state, at least the state of complete withdrawal. So in that negative states, you have one state of withdrawal and complete bottling up, especially when it is led by anger. So the bottling up of anger is so high, and the ego strength also is so high, that the person is able to bottle up, but the side effect of that is a total cut off with the world. Cut off. Self-isolation. So that is even isolation to many of the psychological effects also. Yeah. So often there can be a blanket repression of both the cognitive function, the affective function, or a blanket banning of the affective function. Where you see that very stone-like, mask-like faces. That actually the psyche wanted to ban few affects, but it was difficult to differentiate. So it banned, put a blanket ban on all affects first. And then you have those
mask type of faces. And of course, that is after a deep disappointment and lot of bottled up anger. So this is one component. The second component is of the breaking of the pain of the injured narcissism. And the pain of the injured narcissism taking oneself back to the state of primary narcissism. So it's like, if the world is not my world, I say goodbye to the world. So it's that kind of thing. And the third is what you said of that nameless call. That nameless call from deep within, which can't be connected to, can't be articulated. And that is calling for some addressal, some defense. If that is very strong, it can lead to a lot of problems. And the good part would be if symptoms emerge. Because then the traumatic part at least has some link to the symptom which is becoming conscious. But if the traumatic part causes negative symptoms, that is a difficult situation. Coming back to the question that we had of the early life phenomena involving the other and from pathology standpoint, I said the first was the oceanic state, the positive and negative. The second is the fear of the merger. And there is also a desire of merger. One of the discussions we had is titled The Urge to Merge.
Urge to merge.
So there is always this force of fusion in us, which wants us to merge back and lose oneself. And there is a force in us to separate from everyone else and be free. So both these forces are always at work in us. The force of individuation to always be completely free, and the force of fusion to always merge back and lose oneself. To have the other, to not have the other, to lord over the other, and to be free of the other. All the four. All the four forces are at work. So the first difficulty that we see is the whole problem of the merger. The urge to merge and the fear of this urge. It's very anxiety provoking. The more fragile the ego is, the more difficult is this problem of the fear of the urge to merge. What if I merge back? What if I am swallowed by somebody? What if I fuse into somebody and cease to exist? Very psychotic kind of fear. But related to very early life stage where there was a fear of the urge to merge. Because just after you separate, there is a desire to merge and there is a fear, what if I give into this desire? So there is an urge to merge and there is a very strong anxiety of this urge to merge. The anxiety of merger. And this is found in many psychotic cases. Then we have the anxiety of disintegration. The self which has been formed is very fragile and there is a fear of disintegration. And this we find in all fragile cases where they cannot take interpretations. They cannot take challenge. Some can even not take even the frame of the therapy. Some just cannot accept they have a problem. Fragile narcissism is very common. That the most difficult problem for them is to accept that they have a problem. And the moment somebody makes them accept, they will break away from that person. Like even the psychiatrist, if he says, please take your medicines regularly, indirectly he is saying, accept you have a problem and you need medicine. They will immediately break away from that psychiatrist.
So there is a defense of denial being used to accept.
But below that defense of denial is the anxiety of disintegration.
This is the disintegration of ego.
That is why they use that is why they use this denial, even though it is dysfunctional. So the denial has a huge cost which they pay. Because of the denial, they cannot address the issue and they keep paying the cost of the symptom. But in their unconscious mind, this cost is lower than the cost of disintegration, which will come from accepting that they have a problem. It's a very fragile balance. It's like somebody hanging from one rope. And you are asking the person to come off the road and do a somersault. So it takes a long time before the fragility is taken care of, before the regular psychoanalytic process can begin. So they are in the pre-psychoanalytic state. They are not ready yet for psychoanalytic classical treatment. Coercion treatment is different, but not the classical treatment.
Somehow, while you're explaining this also falls into, I don't know if this is the right word, but it falls into that chronological order of how there's fear of oceanic fusion, and then the merger, and then there is a disintegration in the therapy space when this person is being brought. So this has come up in a very chronological order. Correct. What you have just mentioned.
Correct. Because in regression, you take the reverse developmental route. Right. Not always, but many times.
Mostly.
Yeah. So there are psychotic problems which involve merger and disintegration. Then there are issues of self-annihilation. What if I merge back and cease to exist? Or what if I fragment and cease to exist? Fragmentation anxiety is one of the most underrated forms of anxiety in psychoanalysis. It's far more potent than we believe. And the state of self-annihilation by merging or by disintegrating. So involving fragmentation anxiety or involving merger, swallowing. In disintegration, one of the things I forgot was when you have partial disintegration, often there are fears of invasion. The boundaries are not deemed to be stable and there is fear of invasion, and have many psychotic fantasies of being invaded by objects.
Delusion of persecution.
Yeah, one particular form of that. One particular form of that. So delusion of persecution can take many forms. One of the forms is invasion.
Invasion.
And that would happen when the boundaries are weak because of partial disintegration of the self or the ego. So then this is disintegration, the fear of self-annihilation. So first there is annihilation of the other, and then there is fear of annihilation of the self. So if the other is something you are invested in, one of the neurotic fears can be something happening to the other. And one of the psychotic fears can be the fear of annihilation of the self. And you can have the fears coming one after the other. First, the annihilation of the other, and then the annihilation of the self. Or somebody can just have the annihilation of the self fear. The rendition can be in different colors and flavors.
Annihilation of the other can be in form of the murderous, torturous rage. Okay.
Or the past experience that what I love or like is bound to be destroyed by destiny, will be taken away from me. And this can happen, you rightly said, in case of early life abandonment, in case of orphans. Because there the abandonment is real, it's not perceived.
Right.
So then you have the fear of fusion and also the ecstasy of fusion. So many pathological conditions are where I and the other are not as they should be in an adult state. The I is not a stable adult I, the other is not the stable adult other, And the relation between I and the other, the object relations, are not those of stable, healthy I and other. But they may
Chaotic
not be,
and chaotic and erratic.
yeah. But then, yeah. So there can be various forms of it. The whole spectrum of object relations, pathological object relations.
Consistency, everything.
But one important, sorry?
I'm trying to understand how it will be different from, because in oceanic and merger, there seems that small I is getting merged into the bigger I. That is the need. While in fusion, there is both are incompatible, but yet they fuse somewhat.
Yeah, there can be incompatible fusion and there can be compatible fusion, but still, how do I put it? Compatible at the conscious level, incompatible from a psychoanalytic standpoint.
Got it, got it.
Take pathological fusions of the dependent and the narcissist.
Narcissist.
From a psychoanalytic standpoint, it's a pathological fusion.
Ji.
But to the two of them, it's ecstatic. Consciously and unconsciously, both, it's ecstatic. So you can have pathological ecstatic fusions. And similarly, you can have self-transcendence, where there is no other. And the self is also kept aside. There is no self, and yet one is blissful and peaceful. It is not a pathological state. It's a spiritual state.
Yes.
So there is a self-transcendence state, and there is an ecstatic fusion state, and there is a terrifying fusion state. We are nearing time for this session. Something more is to be said. We'll continue with this answer in the second part.
Right, sir.